Not likely the outcome that Donald Trump was expecting, but Facebook's oversight board is not allowing the former president back on its platforms. That includes Facebook itself and Instagram. Here to talk about the impact of this decision and what it might mean for the average American is our good friend over at Cnet, Ian Scher. Ian, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, as you saw, had a little bit of a slip up. I was looking at
Totally
former
normal.
President Donald Trump's name in the prompter, and I called him current President Trump. It's all a mess. But with regard to the Facebook Oversight Board's decision, obviously the former president has been banned for some time. They are putting the decision now into the hands of Mark Zuckerberg, I guess giving the company 6 months from today to make a final decision as to whether they want to ban him outward or not. What does a decision like this mean in the grand scheme of things?
Part of this issue has been, what do we do about world leaders who use social media to stir trouble, to incite violence, to encourage harassment, and a lot of other things that frankly are against the terms of service on these platforms and would get the rest of us kicked off. And what Facebook is dealing with now is that their oversight board, which in a lot of ways was created, it feels like, to respond to a lot of the pressure that came from the president and his allies about how Facebook handles its harassment and all of these other issues. It said, look, we're not going to sit here and be a scapegoat for Facebook. Facebook needs to have consistent rules and policies, and then it needs to enforce them. And it can't just knock it over to us to be the people who say Trump can stay or go. And I think that that's really important. It marks a moment on the internet where not only has Facebook set up this supposedly kind of quasi-independent board of 20 experts in free expression and journalists and all sorts of other people you would think would err on the side of giving Trump his account back. And they said, no, we're not going to weigh in on that. We're going to tell Facebook to come up with the policies first, and then maybe we'll say something.
Why do you think the waters have been so murky with Facebook with regard to this? I know it does come down to free speech, but at the end of the day, insightful speech is not one of the forms of speech protected under the Constitution. So why have the waters been so murky with this company?
Well, nothing you say on Facebook is protected by the Constitution. That's part of what a lot of people have struggled with, is that the First Amendment protects you and me from the government silencing us. But it says nothing about Mark Zuckerberg. And so part of the struggle I've had, and I've written about on Cnet, is that we have a 36-year-old unelected white man making all of these decisions about what, the fate of nearly 3 billion people on the internet is. And that just isn't right. And so forcing Facebook to come to terms with that, in a lot of ways, I think is very good. Now, ultimately, what I've kind of put my support behind is the idea of a completely independent board that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube all have to support, that makes all of these decisions, instead of leaving it to people like Mark Zuckerberg, who has a profit motive at the end of the day. He has a fiduciary duty to all of his shareholders and his own wallet. And so I think it's very important for Facebook to be put in this position, for them to be told, you need to come up with consistent policies that are fair and that are easy to understand, and then you need to enforce them.
Do you think that it's going to be that cut and dry come 6 months from now when Facebook has to make a decision? I know they have to make a decision by then, but as you mentioned, Mark Zuckerberg and just really private entities are after revenue, after money. And, we're dealing with something that's much larger than that here. Do you think that we are going to be in a position in 6 months from today where it's, either yes or no?
I mean, they're going to come up probably with a yes or no. But I think what's problematic and what President Trump and his allies will always hang on is that this is all being done after the fact. Right? Facebook was not following its terms of service for 4 years when President Trump violated its terms left and right and center. And Twitter and YouTube did the same thing. And it took the death of 5 people at the US Capitol, including a police officer, for them to actually act on this. And that is why we're in this mess. Hopefully, it will cause all of these companies, not just Facebook, to really take a close look at how they handle these things and what they want to be. Do they want to be the people who silence the President of the United States? Or do they want to try and figure out how they can manage their platforms in a responsible way?
Do you think this would ultimately lead to more expenses for these, social media outlets, maybe coming up with some sort of additional department to possibly look at language or behaviors on social media carried out by people in positions of power? Because it's not just, people like you and I, as you mentioned, it is people like the president or leaders of other countries.
It's already cost Facebook untold billions of dollars. They've tried to invest in artificial intelligence, which is basically, a fancy way of calling computer programs that are able to identify hate speech and all sorts of other stuff. And they say they've done pretty well. And to their credit, when it comes to child exploitation and terrorism, they are pretty good at pulling it down. But when it comes to the rest of this stuff, they've really struggled. They've invested in tons of people around the world to do this, to help manage this platform. They've pretty much failed at the biggest tests they've come across. And so as a result, here we are. I think that ultimately it's going to have to be that there's going to have to be organizations that are divorced from profit motive, who are funded somehow, hopefully by these companies, that manage all of this. Because no matter what decision Facebook makes, or Twitter, or YouTube, there will always be the question, well, were you after the almighty dollar, or were you trying to do the right thing? And that just isn't going to work.
And so again, the decision has to be made 6 months from today. What do you think happens, or do you know what happens from now until that deadline? Are there going to be, hearings? Is there going to be obviously things that are happening behind the scenes? Do you know what kind of happens within the next 180 days?
That is actually at the center of why I'm so critical of all this. There is no process. We don't know. And that is part of the huge problem here. When it comes to the United States justice system, we know the process it goes through. We watch it on Law and Order every night. And so the thing is that there is no equivalent on Facebook. And maybe this is a lesson that we need some sort of a justice system on the internet. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know how it acts. But I do know that just going by the whims of a company, again, that we question their motives, is not going to work.
Well, like I said last time we spoke, it's been a long time coming that something like this, take place. Unfortunately, people's lives had to be lost for something like this to even be triggered, or sorry, poor choice of words, but for something like this, for the catalyst to take place for something like this to happen. But here we are. So now we just kind of have to wait to see what happens within the next 6 months, and if there is anything that's going to be happening, if they are going to be transparent about it or not. Ian, is there anything else that you want to leave our viewers with regard to this?
I think the bigger question after all of this is done, and 6 months from now, I want to see what Twitter and YouTube do. I want to see what Shopify, which, by the way, President Trump used to sell t-shirts on, he was kicked off of there. I want to see what they do. And I want to see how everyone kind of acts after Facebook, because they're all going to have to reckon with this. It's not just Facebook's problem anymore.
Well, I think this decision that Facebook ends up making in 6 months to some degree should set some precedent. So again, it's just a waiting game, and time will tell. Ian, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.